Homosexuality seems to be an issue that has absolutely plagued African and Caribbean nations over the years. Do governments and political leaders have their priorities in order monitoring homosexuality when things such as child marriage and healthcare services still need to be tackled? These are the issues that we will be discussing today on the show. Thank you if you're joining us at home. Thank you to my studio audience. As you know from the introduction, today we're going to be talking about the manner in which homosexuality is received in African and Caribbean countries and across the diaspora. So I'd like you to help me in welcoming my guest panellists. I have here Reverend Jide Macaulay. Reverend Macaulay is an Anglican minister. He is the pastor of the House of Rainbow Ministry, which welcomes people of all sexualities, including sexual minorities. He's an openly gay pastor, he's of Nigerian origin, and he's also a human rights consultant. And we have here the very esteemed Dr. Rayu from SOAS University. He's a lecturer there. He's also an author. He has been a fellow at Oxford University, and he's been hailed by the BBC as an expert that the role of religion plays in anti-gay sentiment in Uganda. So please welcome Dr. Rayu.
Thank you.
Reverend Jide, there's a very strong statement on your website. It says, I'll just read this out, "I want to tell you that those that say we cannot be gay and Christian are wrong. Those who said we're an abomination to God are wrong. Often what they want us to do is deny our God and our sexuality. They want us to put Jesus in a box." Would you like to just expand on that?
Many people have always said that, homosexuality is a sin. And I think that often, my, very beginning is to say that, there is actually nowhere in the Bible that condemns homosexuality. And I think that, the condemnation of homosexuality in the Bible is based on 3 verses and of the scriptures. And I think that, what we're saying is that, people need to take time to look at how the scriptures are, translated or interpretation of those verses over time. There are many things in scripture that, have been laid aside that we no longer scrutinize or condemn people on these issues. Okay. So I find it quite condescending when, people believe that same-sex relationship, is a sin. But we really need to now look at, how do we apply the Bible today and how do we apply it to the millions of same-gender loving individuals?
Okay. If homosexuality existed in a biblical area, do you believe that it did?
I certainly do.
Okay, so then if the Bible was written in that period and, it wrote some pretty damning remarks.
We need to get this clear. There are no damning remarks, written in the biblical eras. Okay, it is the interpretation of what is written that, that we need to challenge today. And that's what we seek to do.
Let me just bring in Dr. Rayu. Do you think that religion, that Christianity per se, is compatible with homosexuality?
Well, I'm not really a scholar on religion. I'm a scholar of the politics of religion. Okay. So I've been looking more at why the issue of homosexuality has become such a big issue suddenly, very recently, in the politics of countries like Uganda, for example.
You've had evangelists such as Scott Lively and people of his consort go into Uganda and, well, they've been criticised as stirring up anti-gay sentiment. Is that what you're kind of
It is what I'm referring to. You're right that it's not an issue that has necessarily been embraced in a widespread sense for a long time. Yeah. On the other hand, it has not been politicized, and this sort of emphasis on passing new laws that increase criminal penalties for same-sex sexuality is a very recent development. Okay. So although the law has always been hostile in post-colonial Uganda, for example, to same-sex sexuality, this ramping up of penalties and punishments is a very recent development.
Okay, I'm very interested in what the audience think. How do people understand the scriptures in the Bible about homosexuality? Is there anyone that would like to comment?
There is in the Bible part that God did not agree with homosexuality, and Sodom and Gomorrah is actually destroyed because of homosexuality.
I think that the mistake that people make is that they do not read Genesis chapter 18 to work out and understand the background to the story itself. Long before the angels visited Sodom and Gomorrah, there's an outcry out of Sodom and Gomorrah, which God is actually looking into at that point. And God decided to send his angel to Sodom and Gomorrah to look into these issues. Now, Lot, the nephew, of Abraham, was actually, visiting this particular, is living in this new city. And of course, the understanding is that the people of the city were inhospitable, to the poor. They do not like, visitors. And I think that the core of Sodom and Gomorrah is that, Lot was discriminated against. They wanted to break down his door. I'm sure if somebody threatened to break down your door in England today, it's called attempted criminal damage. If someone attempts to rape your guest or do things to your guests, you call them threatening behavior. Those are the things that are going on. Now, there is actually no account of a sexual act. It simply says that, we want to know your visitors. And even if...
So what does... Can I just...
Hold on.
What does that word know? We want to know.
We want to know your visitor.
What does that
there are
actually mean?
There are different interpretations of we want to know your visitor. I'm a Nigerian man. I'm Yoruba. If I come to you and I say I want to know you, I'll say that I want to know you in my language. I'm not saying I want to have sex with you.
Okay. So let me just hold you for 1 second there,
you.
because I spoke to another young person who's an LGBT rights activist, and he also mentioned this fact that there are different interpretations of the word no. And he said that some people understand no as a sexual thing.
Do not mix, slangs. And, we're talking about a word that is very critical, especially when we're looking at condemning, millions of citizens. We cannot use that word alone. Look, let us go back, when the Bible in Genesis chapter 4 itself, it says that, Adam knew his wife. The translation there was Adam, made love to his wife. Why don't we then say that the people of Sodom wanted to make love to the visitors? Why must it be sex in such a way that is so derogatory? Do you understand me? So at the end,
what would have been, because they were, as I understand it, they were men onto men.
Yeah, they were men onto men.
So if it was make love or sex, or whichever way you want to break it down, does it not have the same?
It doesn't have the same meaning.
Okay.
If you go back, in scriptures before Genesis chapter 19, there are several instances, where it says Adam knew his wife. You understand me? Other translations said Adam made love. But when we came to chapter 19, why didn't it say that the people of Sodom wanted to make love? Look, let me tell you one thing. Right? Let's get this right. A group of people in any borough of London will not just show up at my door saying that they want to make love to my visitor in such violent way. It doesn't happen in the gay community. We're not mad people. We're not sexual freaks.
What do we think about his interpretation? Sorry, there's a lady there, also there with the glasses there.
Leviticus chapter 18.
Oh, we've actually got a scripture
Verse
here.
22.
Okay.
It says, "Do not lie with a man as one lies with a woman. That is detestable." As a man of God, how do you interpret that? It says it is detestable for God. You will keep talking about interpretation. We are not talking about interpretation. We are talking about the word. What does the word say about homosexuality?
Okay, before I come back to you that you can give your response, I know you're waiting, don't worry. Can I just have this gentleman here?
For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him. But their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed indecent acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty of their perversion. It describes, a sexual act between two men as being detestable. I don't think that you can interpret that any other way.
Yeah,
okay.
I can respond to all of them. Okay. Let's first begin. I mean, the lady that quoted Leviticus, I'm quite surprised that you didn't quote the other parts of Leviticus that talks about, we should not eat, crops that are in mixed crops. We should not, wear garments that are made of mixed fabrics. If your daughter is not a virgin, at the time of marriage, they should be put to death. If parents are, if children, misbehave, they should be killed. So don't tell me today that, we should maintain a law that is so ancient to criminalize homosexual people that's got nothing to do.
I'm going to jump in and agree
Thank
with you, Jide, there. Can you explain to me what's happening, and that probably links into this, with the development of anti-gay sentiment in Uganda?
Sure. A lot of the political and religious discussion around this began in the late 1990s, and what was significant about that moment is that, you know, every 10 years the Anglican Communion has a major conference at Lambeth here in London to discuss the future of the Communion. In the run-up to the 1998 meeting of the Communion, Christian evangelicals in the United States were very concerned that they were losing the culture wars, so-called, on their home turf in the United States, on issues like same-sex marriage, the ordination of homosexuals as bishops, and so forth.
Why do you think that is? Why were they losing ground?
Because American society is changing, because social attitudes and views on a number of these issues is changing. Younger people have very different views on questions like abortion and homosexuality than previous generations did.
Okay.
The world is changing on all sorts of issues, including race, for example. The kinds of racist attitudes that were widely prevalent in the 1960s are no longer as widespread, even though racism hasn't gone away, and that's a good thing.
So do you think that that change in America is just basically a part of modernism where there's like an evolution going on and the feelings that were held before are not as relevant?
I think lots of surveys have shown that attitudes towards these questions are shifting, that age matters and is shaping attitudes towards these issues. And yes, I think you're right that it's part of how we think about modernity and modernization, and that is also reshaping social values in some ways, some possibly for the better and some maybe not so much for the better.
Okay.
But that's, in a sense, the political debate that we are having today.
Part of that political debate also is quite dangerous, because when you have, you know, a religious community or a church, you know, promoting or sponsoring a bill that is, you know, asking for the death penalty. And I can tell you this one, the anti-gay law that is recently passed in Nigeria was actually promoted by the churches in Nigeria. And, you know, this is, again, the Bible says that thou shalt not kill.
But that was nullified, wasn't it?
No, it wasn't
That's the
nullified.
Ugandan one.
That's the Ugandan one. The Nigerian law is still law today.
Right.
And just last week, 25 innocent gay men were arrested in Kebbi in the northern states and marched forward to the Sharia law court. You know, we don't know what their fate is going to be. So, I mean, religion really should not be, you know, the status quo for the state, you know. So what happened to democracy in that sense? So what is important is that, you know, I think that, you know, people should be able to live their life freely of religious pressures around these issues. And is the view of or an interpretation of these things, you know, are in itself, you know, now kind of like old-fashioned. We need to move forward and look at new information.
Okay, we're just going for a break. So whatever you do, don't move from your seats. We'll be right back with more from Heart of Matter. Welcome back to Heart of the Matter. I'm Yvonne Osei, and if you missed the first part, we were speaking about the politics of homosexuality in Africa and across the diaspora. We mentioned the politics of it, the relevance and the role that churches play in it. And I have Reverend Jide Macaulay from House of Rainbow Fellowship and Dr. Rahu from SOAS University. So, okay, Dr. Rahu, I'm going to start with you. So homosexuality is illegal in about 37 African countries, but the laws were kind of inherited from colonialism. So does that mean that African countries were against it before the law came in, or, you know, what is the relevance of that? Because if those laws weren't in place, does it suggest that Africans weren't as homophobic as the laws and the attitudes now suggest? What do you think?
Well, historians and anthropologists have shown that there were a whole range of same-sex practices in many African countries across the continent. There's a lot of research establishing this. What the colonial law does for the first time is it makes it the state's business to begin to police these issues in a way that didn't happen
so that's
before.
the distinction.
That's the distinction.
Okay.
This is not to say that the new elites who began ruling independent African states were not equally homophobic. They were. But their reasons for homophobia are somewhat different. You have to sort of put yourself in the shoes of that time and that place. One of the things colonialism does, and the decades and decades of occupation does, is it engenders a kind of humiliation of masculinity in these states and societies. And so some of the
for the African and Caribbean
for
men
the liberation
who,
movements, yeah.
Okay.
So the African and post-colonial liberation movements became very invested in constructing these anti-colonial nationalist movements that would repel colonialism. And they believed that in order to repel colonialism, they needed to emphasize the masculine, the martial in their cultures, and to de-emphasize anything that related to androgyny or same-sex sexuality or effeminacy. And so you see in post-colonial African liberation movements, not just in Africa but elsewhere as well, sometimes strong strains of misogyny and homophobia. So Mark Epprecht has written about this in the context of Zimbabwe, talking about ZANU-PF in that country, and it's also been written about in other contexts as well. So the new elites who led these states were very happy to continue these laws for entirely different reasons, right? So the same law, but serving different purposes for the colonial rulers.
So this
and the
new purpose is?
The new purpose is to fashion movements that can repel colonialism, to sort of inculcate these masculine martial virtues that can repel colonialism, and to sort of punish any signs of weakness or effeminacy or what was seen as degeneracy in their own cultures.
You know, that's a very good point that you've raised there, Dr. Ra. I think that the other thing again is that let's be mindful, you know, the criminalization is actually quite heavy on male homosexuality and not on female homosexuality. So
Why is that?
Because we're talking about the evil of patriarchy, you know. I mean, the African patriarchs think that, oh, 2 women is actually more better than 2 men. So the idea, I mean, there are a lot of research. Stephen Murray wrote the book, Boy, Wives, Female, Husband, which is a chronicle of African sexualities over the ages. Quite very strong, you know, documentation, scholarly debate that was documented. And of course, Godio Pell, you know, spent 10 years in northern Nigeria. Do you understand me? And he wrote a book called Allah Made Us. You know, under the auspice of Bayero University, one of the, you know, high, you know, ranking universities in Nigeria, about homosexualities in the northern states of Kano. So, I mean, and he documented this, you know, and, you know, historically, you know, highlight the you know, the patterns of homosexual behavior and homosexuality in itself, you know, over the period of 10 years that he was there. He was able to collect a lot of data. And then how can they now turn around that, you know, and say that, you know, homosexuality is not African? So there are research out there, you know, and there are more research that is going on.
Lesbianism in African and Caribbean communities is kind of treated like, they call them lesbian friends, and, you know, apparently these kind of things started in dormitories at school, and it's kind of, they see it sometimes as a phase and maybe, you know, it will kind of blow over. But when it comes to men having sexual relations with other men, it's an entirely different ball game, and I think the men are treated completely differently. Do join in the argument at home. We're at HOTM World, or hashtag Heart of the Matter. But Jide, I want to come back to you. What was it like for you growing up as a gay man in Nigeria? I'm sure people at home and in the audience are absolutely fascinated.
Well, I mean, it was difficult. I mean, I was brought up in a Christian home. You know, my parents were loving and, you know, I had a very loving environment. Okay. But I think that, you know, the issues with my sexuality, I've always kind of known that I was gay when I was 7 years old, because...
What was that moment? Like, how...
You know, I mean...
It's very interesting to be aware of
the aha moment about sexuality is about, you know, the differences towards the, you know, the opposite sex or the same sex. You know, at 7 years, I knew certainly that I was different, but I didn't have a name for it. I didn't have a phrase for it. Africans don't have...
How did you feel at 7 years?
At 7 years old, you know, I felt very different. How can I put it? Let me move forward to when I was like 13, 14 years old, at puberty, you know.
Okay.
Because I think in that sense, you know, I can make a distinction about my feelings, you know. You know, I didn't have a sexual attraction towards girls when I was 13, 14 years old at all.
All right.
You understand me?
And did your male friends, did you notice that they had...
No. Well, I mean, my peers at that age were all talking about girlfriends and having girlfriends.
And you weren't interested in that?
No, I wasn't interested in that at all.
Okay.
So I think that says the difference. I think that, you know, if I was in an environment that is accepting of same gender, you know, then I would have been brought up and nurtured well. But let me tell you, the other impact is also my Christian faith. I was brought up in church. I love church, and I still love church today. I love God with all of my heart. Even today, I tell my friends that I'm the happy, holy homosexual. You know, I mean, you know, people laugh and giggle.
So you feel as though people need to get over the fact that you're gay and Christian?
No, it's not that easy, nor is it straightforward. You understand me? We need a lot of education around these issues, you know. Right, okay. We need to mainstream these issues. We need to normalize these these issues so that, families and parents are not afraid of differences. You understand me? If you have an albino child, you don't throw them away. Why should you then, put down your gay child? I think that parents also need to, take, note of these issues, when you give birth to a child, you rejoice. You don't throw a child out with the bathwater, as they often say. The issue of sexuality is only one thing, We also go on to become other things. Recently Tim Cook, announced that, he's gay. He's the CEO of one of the top branded companies in the world. It makes a difference to know that,
That's
gay
Apple,
people can
for
also
those
be
of
quite
you who
successful.
don't know.
So...
Can I
Yeah.
just add a footnote?
Sure. I've noticed. I'm coming back to you.
Just on the point about lesbians, it's not always the case that lesbians get an easier ride, if you like.
I've
in
heard
the
of
law,
corrective rape and
because
things like this in South Africa,
that's
where
definitely
lesbians.
a big phenomenon.
Yeah.
But also, although the law was originally silent on lesbianism, some countries have passed new laws that newly criminalize same-sex sexuality between women. Malawi is one example,
Okay.
but that's something to be aware of.
The lady there with the colourful scarf. Can the camera go to her?
My question goes to the minister, please.
Reverend Jide.
Reverend, yes. My Bible tells me that go ye into the world and multiply. So if man keeps on, having sex with men, how are we going to handle that?
When the Bible says go ye and multiply, you understand me? There are men and women, husband and wife, that cannot procreate, medically, they cannot procreate. We don't turn around to say to them that, God is judging them or God is punishing them. You understand me? And homosexuality is not about, controlling the population. This is about a group of people, very small minority of the world population will not make a difference. I mean, what I say is that, for the heterosexuals that go ye and procreate seriously, then have 20, 30 children and leave the gays alone.
So this means if they had multiple children.
We will adopt your children, we'll look after them.
My name is Charles. I was born in Uganda, and I've been very, I feel offended by a country like Uganda, and Nigeria, and many others in Africa, where they condone homosexuality. And
Where they
when you
condemn homosexuality,
yes, yeah. When you talk about human rights, we've been fighting for human rights as African people, as black people. Why do we fail to do the same to gay people? And for me, that's my major question. And for me, I look at the politics of homosexuality, where the regions are fighting for the turf of what you call believers. So the Anglican Church and the Catholic Church are losing the flock to the evangelicals. And they are trying to fight using homosexuality as a tool to win these spiritual people, or the people who go to church. And to me, the politicians have also seen a void where the majority of people, like in Uganda, about 70% are homophobic people.
Okay.
So they're trying to go into that same group of people. And I feel it is very, very, very wrong.
Okay. The final question for the lady behind.
I quickly want to address this term love, because usually people, when we say love, we think we should all be accepting and tolerant of everything. But in the Bible, love, when God says, do you love me, it means, do you follow my commands? And as we've heard people quote, in the Bible, it clearly says that homosexuality is condemned. So when you say you love God, you should be following what is said in the Bible. So I think being a Christian and being homosexual is binary opposites. I don't think it's possible.
Okay, well, we're running out of time. Gentlemen, thank you so much you've actually enlightened us today. Don't forget, do join us on Twitter, #Heart of the Matter, at Heart of the HOTM World. I'm Yvonne Osei, this is Heart of the Matter. Until next time, thank you.